And he was a nightmare to guard.
I always wish if I had one player to play with, it was this guy. Because listen, he could do everything I could do, but he was taller. Here's a guy at 6'9" that moved as if he was 6'3", can literally do everything. He could turn left shoulder, he can turn right shoulder, he could score from the post, he could score from the perimeter, he could facilitate, he could defend. Every time I played against him, it was like trying to solve a puzzle. Try to invent schemes almost, because regular ones wouldn't work.
The thing that I saw in him was that he did everything so easily. It gave the appearance that he was nonchalant, that he didn't care. But when you broke it down on film, he was fast, he was athletic. His moves were quick, but they looked slow because they were that fast. One of the most iconic players of the 2000s. If you watched the NBA back then, you remember how exciting Tracy McGrady really was. A perennial all-star who attracted fans from all walks of life. He wasn't just an incredible shooting guard, it was the flash, the style, the demeanor that captivated the audience every night. However, how much of T-Mac's greatness is due to nostalgia? For many of us, it was an era that we grew up in as kids, so we wish we were sent back to that time. A time when we got home from school on a weekday, did some homework, ate dinner with our family, and watched our favorite players on the CRT. So, is our perception of T-Mac and just the overall era of the 2000s warped from reality just because of nostalgia? From the point of view of most analysts, the 2000s were actually one of the worst eras in basketball. So many slow-paced slugfests. So many inefficient offenses that relied heavily on ISOs and long twos before the pick and roll became the primary offensive weapon. It was common to see final scores in the 70s, so it was kind of ugly. Anyway, how's it going, folks? My name's Andy, and today let's talk about Tracy McGrady. And let's try to be as objective as possible. How good was he actually? How good was he compared to his peers, like Kobe, for example? Also, we know his career plummeted because of injuries, but is there a reason why those injuries happened in the first place? There's been some theories about that too. Anyway, let's get started. Drafted in 1997 out of high school, the Toronto Raptors were still in the early stages. They've only been a new team for like 2 years, so getting T-Mac was a step in the right direction. Soon, they'd pair him with his cousin, Vince Carter, and the two of them seemed like the franchise cornerstones. However, in the summer of 2000, McGrady would be a free agent and followed his own path. He didn't want to play in Carter's shadow, and his decision to join Orlando was reinforced when Grant Hill also announced his plans to go there. This dynamic duo was expected to become a dominant duo, and this is where T-Mac's career really took off. Despite playing just 4 seasons in Orlando, T-Mac rose into prominence, becoming an absolute unquestionable superstar. In just his first year as a full-time starter, McGrady became the league's most improved player, and made his first All-Star game and All-NBA team. A few years later, he became the scoring champion, twice. His best season being in 2002-03, where he averaged over 32 points a game, with the highest efficiency of his career. Now, around this time, there were some unfortunate circumstances that prevented the Magic from going further. While T-Mac carried them to the playoffs multiple times, Grant Hill suffered from injuries the entire time. The two of them never consistently played together. Also, while his contemporaries were winning championships, leading their teams to the finals, and even his cousin, Vince Carter, was making a lot of noise in the playoffs, McGrady, on the other hand, continued to lose in the first round. Unfortunately, this would be a trend. It wasn't until 2009 with the Rockets when his team finally won a playoff series. I said his team, not him though. He was actually injured for that playoff run. And then a few years later in 2013, he joined the Spurs, but barely played at all. Whenever he checked into a playoff game, it was garbage time, and he did not score a single point in that entire run to the finals. So essentially, it's safe to say he never made it past the first round in his entire career, well, at least in any year he actually played in. But we're gonna focus on his peak. Back in Orlando, I remember there would be so many people suggesting that, if T-Mac was on the Lakers instead of Kobe, they'd still win 3 championships. People have said if T-Mac got drafted onto the right team, we'd look at him the same way we look at Kobe, and he'd have multiple championships. There was this perception that both were similar players, with some folks even putting T-Mac ahead of Kobe as an individual talent. I think this is a stretch. It's true that there were some years where T-Mac was statistically more productive than Kobe, but overall, Kobe was always the superior player, despite what everyone says. Defensively, it's no contest. Kobe in his younger days was one of the fiercest perimeter defenders the league has ever seen. That's why he made so many all-defensive teams. I realized later in his career some of his defensive nominations were not warranted, and they were just carried by his legacy. But early on, Froby, he was definitely a defensive stud. Since we're on the topic of this comparison, perhaps the biggest difference between Kobe and T-Mac was their work ethic. While Kobe's work ethic was out of this world, T-Mac was, well, he didn't try as hard as he could have. Years later, in an interview, he admitted this. "I just wasn't a great practice player. I just think I could cruise through practice and still be effective. Some guys have to really go all out to really have an impact on practice. My ability was just I had God-given talent to where I could just cruise through practice and still be an effective practice player. I was inconsistent. Some days I had really good days where I just go hard and a lot of days where I just go through the motions." Very rarely did McGrady go above and beyond, and that work ethic was the biggest difference that caused their careers to diverge. Of course, the injuries did not help either, but maybe if he took more care of his body and just worked harder off the court, it could have made a difference. At his peak, McGrady was arguably the most complete offensive player in the league. He could score in ways that you couldn't even imagine, and so easily and effortlessly too. Going head-to-head against his peers, he was a nightmare to defend. In head-to-head matchups, Kobe and T-Mac were relatively evenly matched, at least early in their careers. Against Vince Carter though, McGrady always trounced him. Between 2002 and 2004, T-Mac outscored him in 6 of the 7 times they played each other. Generally speaking, the biggest problem of that era was the efficiency was much lower than most other decades. The 2000s saw a rise of superstar talent, especially on the wings. But there was a lot of bad offense being played. While McGrady had some years like in 2003 where he was quite efficient, a true shooting percentage of 56%, but in other years it was pretty mediocre. At times, when his shot wasn't falling, he would just give up. Like he mentioned earlier, rarely did he ever do more than what he was asked. McGrady always relied more on his natural gifts as opposed to a relentless training regime. Fast forward to 2004. At this point, McGrady was getting tired of the Magic messing around with the roster. They traded away all of his buddies and replaced them with young, inexperienced players, which royally pissed him off. He demanded a trade, and shortly after, it happened. A 7-player deal that saw him head to Houston to team up with rising young star Yao Ming. While it was expected this duo would be a formidable foe, both of them suffered tragic injuries. Even when healthy, the Western Conference was brutal. They struggled to get out of the first round despite being a 50-plus win team multiple years. There's been theories on why McGrady all of a sudden became injury-prone. It's kinda weird when you think about it. He was healthy for his entire career up until his arrival in Houston. Well, the speculation was that he had a muscle imbalance. When he got to Houston, he started hitting the weight room a lot harder. It was visible just from looking at him. He bulked up drastically compared to his lanky days in Orlando. But apparently, he didn't hit legs hard enough. His upper body became massive, but his lower body was still fragile. It resulted in devastating back spasms, a condition that's mainly caused by this kind of imbalance. Then, his knees were next to fail. There was too much stress on them, and it forced him to get surgery. His last real chance came in 2008. McGrady struggled dealing with injuries the entire season until the playoffs began. Against the Utah Jazz, he gave it all he had. In the deciding Game 6, he went off for 40 points. It still wasn't enough. This resulted in the saddest post-game press conference in NBA history.
I said, this team is going to go as far as I take them. And, I tried my best. I tried, man. Maybe I could have did more, but it didn't happen.
So, how good was T-Mac actually? In his prime, definitely a top 5 to top 10 player in the early 2000s. It was unfortunately a very short prime. He had like a 5 to 6 year stretch where he looked fantastic, but the injury started by his mid to late 20s, so he fell off sooner than we expected. Throughout all his time, he's seen his fair share of tragedy and heartbreak, but also gave us some of the greatest moments ever. In 2017, the first year he was eligible to be nominated to the Hall of Fame, he made it without question. Although I remember there was some debate on if he really deserved to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. I mean, those spots are usually reserved for all-time greats, but T-Mac, he was great, but he didn't have any playoff success, nor did he have much longevity. Personally, I do think he's one of those guys who gets glorified. Regardless, they're all still legends, but we do look at them through rose-colored glasses. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope y'all enjoyed the video. What are your thoughts on T-Mac? Where would you rank him among the best players of his generation? And here's the question I addressed earlier. If T-Mac and Kobe switched places, and it was T-Mac who played with Shaq, do the Lakers still win 3 consecutive championships? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And as always, I'll see you next time. Peace.